Howdy everybody, it's Phil Zio here again for another Mix Fix. Yeah, boy, I've been bringing these in left and right recently. Alright, so, this song is called God Mind, and it's by a guy I met recently. His name is Emiel van der Zwaal. I believe I'm saying that right. He made this really cool, really atmospheric, genty, kinda dark sounding, almost video game soundtrack style song here, and let's listen to the one he sent me. Alright, so nothing immediately jumps out at me as being bad, but listen in reference to the one I did. Now listen to the one he did again. It just doesn't feel the same, does it? So I'm gonna gain match the two and see if it has to do with volume. Then mine. And his again. Alright, so as you may have noticed, a lot of it came down to the mix choices, but it was also the EQ curves. If you notice his version, massive dips and a huge bump. That virtually nothing from like 300 hertz to 700 hertz, and tons at like 2K, but very little above 2K. So what the heck? So I basically did an EQ curve to compare his to mine, and what do you know? If you take the EQ curve of my song and put it in with his, it sounds a lot better. Compared to mine. So even though it sounds a lot better, there's still some things that feel weird about it. And most of that's probably just because I took an EQ curve and adjusted it, basically doing the EQ profiling thing that I did in the last video. And just like in the last video, I did the same thing to my song to convert basically mine to his. Compared to his. Now mine still sounds a lot more fluid and a lot more natural, granted, but that just goes to show that there's so much that can be done in the mix that influences the final product that it can radically change the feel of the song. Now one thing that I'm going to say immediately is I felt like the guitars were too loud in his version, even with my adjustments. Notice how turning off all of my processing on his version, the volume still feels weirdly out of proportion with the guitars coming right out and being like massively huge, especially in comparison to the drums. And the stuff in the background just doesn't come out right. It feels really nasally and kind of awkward sounding at best, compared to mine, which again has a lot more clarity. Now, I'm not usually a fan of that kick sound, for example, and there's a couple of things in this mix that I'm not personally huge on, but I think that overall, with this a lot flatter and a lot more consistent across the board with volume levels, that alone takes it from sounding really tinny and not super professional to sounding a lot easier to listen to without really forsaking any of the aggression. So my personal choices aside, let's dig into this mix and I'll show you what I did from start to finish. So here we have his mix project, which I saved my own copy of and renamed it to Godmind Mix Fix. So let's listen to my track without any of the mastering processing that I'd put on into it. You'll notice that it's actually a lot less bright than the final master version, and that's for good reason. During the mastering stage, the things I referenced in order to master my version of the track were very bright, very punchy, very aggressive, and a little bit scooped. However, when I was mixing it, I really wanted to get a feel for clarity in the mid-range, and I wanted to make sure that everything had its own space in the mid-range in order to come out fully before I started brightening everything up with lots of processing and all that. So, let's move on to the drums. First thing you'll notice is no toms, there's only overhead, kick, snare, hi-hat, and ambient close, ambient far rooms. But I also have them sent to a verb track, an echo track, a sub track, a parallel track, and what I called a knocker track. Now, I know that's a ton more processing than I usually do on these kinds of things, but trust me, it'll become apparent very soon why I did all this. So, as you can see, he had everything routed from Superior Drummer, which I don't have, so I'm just going off of the stems that he used. First off, the overheads. Originally sounding like this. I filtered out under 50 hertz, saturated them a lot to give them a lot more clarity in the high end. I added a thump filter, so basically a low end pump up. I also boosted around 270 hertz by like 4 dB, because without that, you really can't feel the overheads as much as I wanted to. So I also cut 400 hertz by like 6 dB with a massive Q. Because all the low end boosting I'd done also brought up harmonics in that 400 hertz area. I cut 4K. Just to tame the hi-hats and the crashes a little bit. And then I boosted over 7K by 2 dB. I also have a compressor on this channel, doing anywhere from no gain reduction to like 6 gain reduction on the worst of the hits, just to even things out with a really fast release and a slower attack. And that's all I did to the overheads. So up next, I have the kick. It sounds very clacky. Without my processing. With. What I did was, high pass to 45 hertz, saturated a whole bunch, low pass at 12K, boosted them lows at about 70 hertz by like 2 dB or to 3 dB, boosted 1K by 5 dB, boosted 3.2K by 3 dB, and boosted 9.6K by 12 dB. Without it, the kick loses all the high end. Without the mid-range, it falls through. Without that center tone, it doesn't have the thwack that I'm going to expect it to have to compete with the bass and the guitars. I'm also cutting 150 hertz with a de-esser and just a little bit of 4.4K where it was giving me a clacking sound that I didn't like. I also have this compressor, 2-to-1, fast release, fastish attack, doing like 4 to 5 dB of gain reduction. Really brings out the punch of the kick, and clipping it by like 4 dB with JST clip. That's all I need to do to the kick. Up next, I have the snare. I'll get to the verb shortly. But one thing I noticed about your style of mixing, I felt like the more industrial sound suited it a lot better. So, first thing I did, I saturated it, high pass to like 130 hertz, low pass to like 16K, added a thump, boosted the low end, cut some 500 hertz where there was a ring. I boosted some 1.5K because it really didn't have anything in the mid-range to stick out. And I boosted 10K by like 9 dB. So you get the point. I'm trying to make the drums really smack. Without. With. Now that also brought up some 5.69K that had that little bit of like under snare kind of ring. So like the beady sounding snare. Cut that out a little bit. And a little bit of ring in 350 hertz. Where it goes woof, and I don't want it to. Up next, I compressed it with same plus 10 dB compressor. This time it's 3-to-1 ratio, still fast attack, fast release. This time up to like 8 dB of compression. And 4 dB of clipping again with JST clip. Not a ton of processing, just doing what I have to make it sound fatter. Also, the hi-hat, I kept your EQ curve. And your compression, I just lowered the amount of compressing it was doing from like 7 dB of gain reduction to like 3 at any given time. And that's just because I want it to be heard, but not too much. So this is a good example. Where it just comes in there. So up next, I did stuff on the bus. So without all my drum stuff on the bus. With. Did you notice a difference? I hope you did. So let's jump right into what I did. Check this out. More saturation. More thump. A little bit of a shelf boost at like 87 hertz. So it's going to be cutting a little bit of 90 hertz, but boosting half a decibel below that. I also have basically a tenth of a decibel boosted on 370. Doesn't affect the tone at all. I just didn't use that band much. And 1.8 kilohertz across the whole bus is boosted by almost a decibel. The top end boosted by 1 dB with a shelf at like 7K. But mostly what I'm doing here is de-essing at 11K, where there's some tss, tss that I don't like. And at 6K, where there's also some of that crack that I don't like. It sounds a lot more controlled now. It just sounds less plasticky to me. So with that in mind, I also have bus compression running on it. Pretty heavy bus compression, actually. So at any time, it could be doing from like 1 to 6 dB of gain reduction with a loud thrust. 2-to-1 ratio, 30 millisecond attack, and like 11 millisecond release, or 100 millisecond release rather, on this API style compressor. Finally, into finality, which is just a limiter doing like anywhere from 0 to 1 dB of gain reduction, but with the aggro and color modes enabled. So that is all I did to the drums on their own channels. Most importantly, here's what I did to the rooms. I bussed them, crushed them, boosted the low end, here's what they sounded like originally with my adjustments. So really, all they did was all they do is fill out the bottom end a little bit more for the drums. I also boost them in the mid-range ever so slightly so that you get the papery feel of the drums in a room. And I cut some of the harsher frequencies so that when I crushed them, it wouldn't start ringing all over the place. Up next, I have a snare verb. Just a plate reverb. 2 to 3 second decay, pre-delay so that it doesn't hit the original. It's kind of brighter than usual that I'd have on a snare delay, but that's because I wanted it to feel that way, and it's a little bit woofier in the 500 hertz range. So, EQ curve of the snare verb. Just peaking out in the higher end, and a lot of body. So that it sounds more like a room than the rooms do. I also have an echo that you specifically wanted. I put the whole drum bus in there. Then I EQ'd it to cut out some of that low end so that none of the actual hits were getting affected by it. And this just adds like that popping feel to the background. I did parallel compression. I'm boosting the crap out of 1.5K and 700 hertz and high passing it up to like 130. Compressing it so fast and releasing it so fast that it's just absolutely mangled. And lastly, I put finality on that John. So that if I were to bring this up from 23.6 dB to like... it would be absolutely disgusting. But with it just at a little bit, it helps it punch through super tight across all the other mid-range heavy stuff that I'm going to be adding. Up next, I also have a knocker bus, which has basically the kick, the snare, and the rooms. So that just sounds like all I'm doing is boosting the mid-range to give it a drums in room kind of feel and crushing the heck out of it and limiting it. Super fast attack, very fast release. But it really fills out everything and helps it stand out more. Makes it sound more like natural drums, which is going to be very important as we continue to process things and make things sound more extreme. Lastly, I have a sub bus. Low pass to 136 hertz. Boosting the subs and the low focus with Clarisonics. Boosting the low end harmonics with R bass. Compressing it with R compressor, fast attack, super fast release, and limiting it with this L1 knockoff so that the low end stays super consistent. So the important thing about this sub bus to understand is that all the things that are going to it are right here. The kick, the snare, the bass, and the guitar, all of which have elements of the low end that I want to be able to gel together, but to gel together consistently. So I have all this low end added to all of those in varying degrees. I have all the kick added beef, all the snare added beef, but a little bit less bass and a little bit less guitar, so that the kick and the snare have dominance over the others, but I still have that solid low end when it's just guitar or just bass doing its thing. So that's very important to me when it comes to low end. And this time I decided to do it that way, but there's 1,000 ways to accomplish that same thing. The same thing I did here is I took what is called the extreme mid-range enrichment track. All the drums, addition of the snare, bass, and guitar sent to just this. Noticeable from like 400 to 1K. It's basically just this band pass at 600 hertz. And this. Torture, assassinate, 100% drive, American circuit, low cut at 400 hertz, high cut at 1K, overdriven to death. So what that's doing is adding elements of that mid-range back into the mix where it was lacking for a variety of reasons. So up next, I go to the bass. There was DI that I didn't bother to touch because you already had a low grit and dirt section for me already split up. So first thing I did was I took a look at the dirt. This is how it sounded. I cut some of that 2K and 1.8K and boosted some 7K so you get more string air instead of all that. It just sounds gross. After that, I took a look at the bass grit track, cut the same areas, but a little bit lower, so 2.6K and 1.4K, and boosted the air again. This really tames it so that there's not too much 2K going on because the guitars are going to be a mess of 2K. And the bass low track. I really added depth to it by taking a high pass that was resonant and boosting the crap out of like 35 hertz, but cutting everything below 30. Cutting a ton out of 70 hertz so that this doesn't fight with the kick. And cut a whole bunch of 200 hertz so it doesn't fight with the snare. It just shapes the bass a lot. The bass bus, which is a combination of all of those things to varying degrees of volume level. I'm doing this. Saturating a little bit, cutting below 30 hertz, cutting above 9K with a low pass. I'm boosting a ton of 35 hertz again, like 16 dBs worth. Because I want to feel the bass more than I hear it. I cut 400-ish hertz by like 5 dB. And I cut more 2K. Because it was obnoxious to me. So I boosted 1.5K or 1.3K on the bass to help it stand out just a little bit under the guitars. I'm also cutting a massive amount of 3K where there was a clanging resonance. And a bunch of 70 hertz again, so it doesn't fight with the kick. Finally, I've got this compressor, optical, slow compressor, with like a medium attack for an optical and a very fast release for an optical, into a limiter, doing no more than 0 to 1 dB at any given time, just so that it tames it a lot, but it doesn't lose that punch. Notice how the extreme mid-range background is really adding atmosphere too. Without it, everything sounds really clean, and for this style of music, I feel like things should be a lot dirtier. So let's check out what I did with the guitars. Originally, what you gave me was just this. That's all low end and like 2.5K. This guitar has like no tone to it, you know? That was another reason why I added that mid-range enhancement bus, so that I could add some of that 800 hertz back in where these guitar tones don't have any. So aside from that, you also gave me a DI, which I blended with my own tone. That sounds like this. Now this does have a lot of low end, but it also has a more flat range above that low end. So the combination of the two builds the tone a lot more. Especially with some of the mid-range. I cranked the mids, cranked the treble, cranked the presence, and have a little bit more bass. Virtually no added gain, just overdrive. So how did I process that, you may ask? Well, look at it. All that EQing. High pass to 130. Cut 200 hertz, boosted around 400, cut a little bit of 750, because once I added the mid-range enhancement section, that was way too much. Boosted 1.5, cut a little bit of 2.5, boosted everything over that, and then low passed it so that there wasn't too much air. Now you've got a lot flatter, but you still have that booty in the 200 to 300 range. Without. With. You realize how it really brings that to life? So does this. Tape. So what this is doing is boosting a lot of the lower mid-range, boosting a lot of the higher mid-range, cutting out a little bit of the wiry highs, tape saturating like mad with an old school style tape from like 1968, and boosting the lows a lot. So this tape is doing a lot. And this is a multiband compressor. So I'm actually doing a lot of things here, and it might take a little while to follow along, but when you have an ornery guitar tone, multiband compression can make it or break it. So I'm really focusing the tone here. Getting like no more than 1 dB of compression per band, typically, but focusing on the specific parts of the tone that make it interesting. I've got this high air band boosted consistently so that it brings out more of that upper edge. I'm focusing on making sure that 500 to 8K, that 5K to 8K aren't too aggressive. So it's cutting anywhere from like negative 8 dB to like 1.5 dB, but I like it in the middle with a 1.2 dB boost. Same with the band of 2K to 5K, 1.2 dB boost, but it's only ever cutting from like half a dB up to almost 2 dB, or 2.5 dB. Because this band was a little bit aggressive and wiry and hard to control, so I multiband compressed it. This band from 800 Hz to 2K, boosted by 1.2 to flatten out this overall, but never really cutting that much with its compression. Except on the massive chunks when it can go up to like 1.4. Same here. This particular mid-range band from 500 Hz to 800 Hz was where a lot of the body of the guitar is found. So making sure that it's controlled but also brought up in the places where it's not accessible is very important. 300 Hz to 500 Hz, however, is a lot of just woof. And we can afford to have a lot of that, but not too much. So keeping it for me at 1.7 dB of increase, but it cuts sometimes up to 3, just gives the guitar more of a common body. So over here is the chug range, the 100 Hz to 300 Hz. So it's only ever cutting on the big chugs, and so is everything under 100 Hz, just to control it all. So that's a lot of work for a guitar tone. And you may not think it sounds better out of context, but in context it sounds way tighter and works a lot better with the bass. Lastly, I added finality to bring up the overall volume and limit it just enough that it really crunches. So this is bringing out a lot of the body of the guitar. Very important to have that. I noticed in yours that their guitars were literally so scooped that there was no way I was going to be able to fit them in the mix and have them as an integral part. Everything else takes precedence, and that's probably why you were boosting your guitar's volume so much. There was no mid-range. So here we have the guitar backing part. All I did was limit it so that you feel it more than hear it. Center guitars. EQ'd it just so, to overly emphasize the effect. and make it more audible, which is why I did that 670 hertz boost. I did a resonant filter at 6.5K and cut a little bit of 2.1 so that it's still audible over here. But it's still affected sounding. For the synth bus, brought up a lot of highs, controlled 1K to 5K, but brought that up a lot, and brought up a little bit of 200 hertz to 1K, but controlled it just enough. Last thing I did was bring it into a compressor so that it evens out the volume across the board. 2-to-1 ratio, 25 millisecond attack, 0.05 second release, and you're good to go. Lastly, the entirety of the lead delay and original drum echo. I removed the original drum echo and remade it over there. And for the lead delay, I brought up a lot of high end, but compressed it so that it doesn't go overboard. Brought up a little bit of that higher mid-range, because without it, it just doesn't feel shaped enough. And cut a lot of 200 to 1K, while boosting it just enough that on the slower parts, or the lower volume parts, it doesn't disappear completely. Already the mix is coming together beautifully. So, SFX bus, same kind of compression. Cutting the mids below a certain point, but keeping everything concise except the high end, which really this compressor's not doing all that much. It's just making sure that stuff doesn't go overboard. And here's the final compressor on the entire SFX bus. 4 to 8 dB of gain reduction at any given time. Just to keep it controlled behind the guitars so that it doesn't jump out way too much during that one part. We want it audible, we don't want it killing everything. So that was everything I did to your mix, with the exception of the extreme mid-range bus, which, in context, with and without. Without. With. Now you hear that it creates that wah 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 sound, and that's okay, because it's bringing up all those missing mids. And creating an atmosphere in the background that makes it feel some kind of way. And I don't really know why I need that, but in all honesty, I felt like it helped a lot with bringing up the overall tone of all the instruments and bringing it a little bit more to the forefront of your face, while also creating a saturated background that does wonders. So this is what it sounded like when I rendered it out. Now, I did a lot of processing to this one, so bear with me. First thing I did, I added tape emulation from Slate. It seems to make the mids more aggressive, which I think is what you were going for with that upper mid kind of jaunt. And this particular tape style definitely does that. I'm not overloading it, but I'm bringing it up into the needles. If I overloaded it, it would crush it. But I don't want that, I just want the character. So next, because this is such a mid-range heavy song now, and we really want more of that high end across everything, I usually mix with what I'm going to do in mastering in mind, which is why I really focused on the mid-range this time, and in mastering brought it up so that the highs could have all this room to play. So I'm going to A-B this Mag EQ, which has a little bit of sub boost and a huge 40K airband boost with like 9 dB. Do you notice a difference? I hope so. Up next, I have R bass. It's bringing down the volume a little bit so that it doesn't clip, but it's also bringing up the lower end harmonics at around 67 hertz so that it really brings out the bass a lot. You should be able to feel it a lot better now. After that, I have Shep's Omnichannel doing what Shep's Omnichannel does, which is everything I need it to. So check it. Now, what am I doing to create that? Saturating it more by like 20%, even harmonics. Cutting the low end below 35 hertz, again, with a filter. Adding thump. Boosting 70 hertz by like 3.5 dB because I want more thump. Cutting a little bit of 500 hertz. So that the mix breathes a little bit more. Boosting 5.2K by like 1.5 dB. So that you get more of that crunch of the guitars in your face. Boosting the high end by 3.5 dB over 6.7K. So that you get some of that that you really want in a track that's punchy and industrial and crunchy and massive. I also have a de-esser on 700 hertz instead of cutting it back down again. So that it only cuts it when it needs to, when there's too much of it going on. Never more than like 3 dB. Same with 1.5K, but with a smaller band de-esser. Notice it doesn't do a lot until everything kicks in. Then it's like 3 dB to 6 dB. With, without. And lastly, I've got one more de-esser, cutting a tiny bit of 13K, where it's really aggressive from all those boosts. The sideband de-essing at about 160 hertz so that the bass has more room to breathe. And a little bit of mid-band de-essing at like 120 hertz so that stuff doesn't compete as much. There was a lot of buildup there. All this going into the API, like 3 dB of compression pretty consistently. This time a 1.5 ratio and the fastest possible release, slowest possible attack. To tame the mix. Going into a clipper. Multi-band clipping. A lot of low-end clipping, some mid-range clipping. Punchy high-mid clipping, and a lot of upper area clipping so that it smooths out the highs more. A lot of soft clipping in the high end. Lastly, for loudness, I've got a peak catcher, just limiting enough to catch a little bit of peak, so like 1 dB of gain reduction, and then another one for loudness that does like 2 to 3 dB of gain reduction. That makes it really heckin' loud. So, I hope you learned something from this, and I hope that I was able to show you how to get a very close result to what I use, which was from the Doom soundtrack as a reference. A lot of punchy highs and a more industrial, aggressive sounding mix. This has been Phil Zia, One Studio again, bringing you another mix fix. If you have any questions, comments, etc., leave them in the comment section below. Send me a message, do whatever. I'm happy to get back to you. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.